What's up everybody, welcome back to Polygon Academy. My name is Tim and this is part 4, the final video in the trim texture creation tutorial series. In the last video, we created our final trim texture material inside of Substance Painter. If you missed that video, link down in the description below. But in this one, we're going to be taking that final texture and applying it to some 3D geometry. I know for me, when I first started getting into 3D, I hated dealing with UVs. It was a painful process like pulling teeth. And I know for a lot of beginners, they have the same struggles, and there was a lot of questions on the trim sheet overview video that I put out of exactly how do I get all of my UVs, especially from like curved surfaces and stuff, into nice clean strips that you can use with the trim sheets. So I'm going to be showing all the tips and tricks I've learned over the years. I've pretty much come across any situation you can think of and had to figure out how to wrap my mind around stripping things out and using trim sheets with it if it's a large modular kit or even on props and stuff like that too. So hopefully by using these tips and tricks in your own workflow, you can kind of like take the fear away from having to deal with UVs. As always, speed does come with practice. Like for me, I've done this probably close to 1,000 times. But if you're just getting started out, it might take you a bit longer, and don't worry about that. Really focus on just understanding the overall workflow, because that's the most important part. The more you do this, the quicker you'll get at it, and I can guarantee you, once you've done 1 or 2 modular sets or a few different props, you'll be banging out your UVs in no time. So don't forget to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying the content. I'll leave links down to all the other videos in the series down below in case you missed one. But other than that, let's hop out of the computer and get started. All right, so we have our final trim texture. I brought that into Max and just applied it to our basic plane that we've been using. You can see it still has all the subdivisions where we originally had our placeholder trims and all the ones we used to create the high poly geometry and stuff like that. And all those subdivisions still line up perfectly with all the individual grooves and lines in the texture, which is great. What I usually do next is I'll take this and I'll duplicate it, and I'll actually break apart each one of those subdivisions and adjust the pivot so it's at the bottom of each subdivision. That way I can quickly start building things with these. So say I wanted to make a little ledge, I could just take this trim and this trim and grab this top one, rotate it 90 degrees, and then I'm already well on my way to, if I isolate this, having some geometry that I can assemble into really blocky stuff. This is great for blocking in levels with trim textures already applied to your basic geometry. Sometimes I'll build my modular kits with this pre-UV geometry pretty much, and then add some more detail and probably have to adjust the UVs later on, but it gives you a really quick starting point. Also in our scene, I've created this very basic kind of fountain model, because a lot of you guys had questions about dealing with cylindrical shapes. Not so much like the vertical sides of the fountain. I think most of you realize you can probably just quickly give that a cylindrical UVW map, and that'll give you a nice clean strip on any vertical rounded shapes. But a lot of the questions pertain to stuff like these inner top caps and stuff like that, because if you were to give that a planar map, it would just, your UVs would basically be a big circle, and trying to get that adjusted into a clean strip is like for most people it's like, how do I do that? It's a bit of a nightmare. And I basically have 2 main tricks that I use when dealing with trims that I use over and over and again for 90% of all the meshes that I deal with when I'm using trims. And I've never encountered a situation where this first method has ever failed me. And then the second method I'll show you after that is a little bit faster and easier depending on your mesh. But this is like my most basic technique when dealing with trims and getting things into strips. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to UV this bottom lip to be like these kind of, maybe these like cobblestones. So it's just a nice like stone lip around the fountain that when we place it in the world, we can crash it through the ground, and it just kind of grounds it nicely in the world. What I'm going to do is apply our trim texture to this mesh. You can see it doesn't have any UVs or anything like that. And we're going to get started UVing this thing pretty quickly and easily. So I'm just going to isolate this mesh because I don't want anything else in the scene distracting me. And we're just going to, what we're going to do is this first method, I'm going to be using the UVW modifier a lot. And I forgot to actually add it to my quick access buttons. So I'm just going to go to configure modifier sets, add another 2 buttons, and where is UVW map? There it is. So I'm just going to drag and drop UVW map onto one of my buttons because we're going to be using it quite a lot in conjunction with unwrap UVW. So the way that I normally do this is I know I want to just work on these faces right now. So I go into sub-object mode, grab this as a ring selection. In Max, I believe that by default it's Alt-R. In Maya, there's other ways of doing that. In Blender, they must have ring and loop selections too. It's like the most basic things you can use. And then I'm going to convert this to a polygon selection by holding Control and clicking on Polygon. So if I press F2 to toggle the shading of my faces that are selected, you can see it's converted it to all these faces that I want to actually apply to that stone. Then what I'm going to do is add the UVW map. And you can see it by default, it sets to planar. I'm going to actually set this to face. And that gives every face, you can actually see, basically it stacks every one of those faces on top of each other and it's perfectly square on the 0 to 1 UVW grid. So now if I add an unwrap UVW modifier on top, you can see it's all of these faces here just stacked on top of each other. So if I move this one, it's just a perfect square face, which is great. The next thing I usually do is give it a quick relax. In this case, these faces are fairly evenly proportioned in terms of like being a square, but if it was something like these thin ones here, it would still snap them into a square, so you get some crazy stretching going on. But by giving it a quick relax, it gives you the proper ratio in terms of height and width, and that's going to be great for when we start stitching this together, because we don't want to have to squash and stretch these UVs too much. We want them to be the proper width for each strip that we're using on the trim. And what we're going to do is we're going to start stitching this together, but there's one more thing we have to do, because right now you can see the sides of each polygon. It's because the polygon itself is going slightly inwards, because as the circle goes inwards, all the polygons, all the angles on the faces, they don't stay square. So when I relaxed it, it relaxed it into the shape of the actual polygon. And now we get this slanted edge. So if I grab this, move it up here, and then I usually use move and sew. But if I do that, or I think in Max it might be called stitch, or in Maya it's called move and sew. I can't remember the exact terms, but I just set up a hotkey for it, Shift S. So it'll basically take the whatever face is attached to that seam and move it and stitch it to that there. But if I do that, you can see this is going to be a nightmare to deal with, especially because a lot of people might start doing that and then be like, oh, I need to rotate this and then move this, and then you get these really janky, gross UVs. We don't want to deal with any of that. So I'm just going to undo all of that so they're all stacked on top of each other still. I'm just going to go into the vertex mode, grab these ones here, and align them vertically, bam. And these ones vertically here, bam. So now they're aligned perfectly, and we have a nice, clean, straight edge. So when I grab this face, I usually just select on my mesh, any one, it doesn't really matter. Move it above it, because they're all stacked on top of each other. If you start stitching, it's going to maybe be a bit confusing. So I just move it up here and start stitching my strip together. So go into edge mode, and then just Shift S, the hotkey I have set up, and I just quickly stitch out the entire strip. You can just, drag select. Normally I have this on a second monitor, and it's easier to click and drag because you don't have to be super precise. But I just stitch the entire strip together. If you have a lot of segments on a rounded shape, yeah, this can take a little bit more time. I think this one has about 40, so it's not that bad. But I basically just go through and do this. This is a great method for things like arches, where it's not a perfect cylinder. And it's like a curved, spiky arch or something like that. That way, you can just stitch basically as the arch goes up. You're going to have a seam in the center. You just stitch one side of the arch, stitch the other side of the arch into clean strips, and you can have nice, easy to use trim sheet strips for your UVs. So you can see when I stitched that one that time, it looks like it kind of snapped back to the other end. And that actually lets me know that I've reached the end of my UV strip. And then if I also look at my mesh, you can see it shows you the UV seams there, the green lines. There's only one on the mesh. That's perfect. If I wanted to break this strip in half, I could just, if I press Control B to break it, that would break my strips in half, but I don't want that. I want one nice clean strip to deal with. So I'm just going to restitch that. So basically, there we go. That's a nice, easy way to strip things out. It can be, like I said, a little bit time consuming based on how many segments your meshes have. But what we're going to do is turn that on. And if you can't see your texture, you can go to Preferences. and turn your tile brightness up to 1. So if I turn that down, you can see, I think by default it's about 0.5. So if you turn it up to 1, it's a lot easier to use, and you can also, if you increase the tiles, you have to turn on tile bitmap. It'll show you just how the texture tiles in the window too. I usually don't bother with that, but if you want to see your texture tiling just so you can eyeball things better, that's a good thing to do. And then I just would move this into place and scale the strip a little around till it's lining up with these horizontal grooves for these bricks. Because remember, you want the edges of your polygons to align with the edges in between your trim strips. And that way you'll get that nice chunky, damaged edge that flows around your mesh really nicely, like I showed in the first trim texture tutorial. Something like that. And then I just collapse all. And you can see now it's perfectly UV'd to that strip. I'll demonstrate that method one more time really quickly. Just select your ring, convert it to a polygon selection, UVW map, face, unwrap UVW, select all the faces, tools, relax, hit apply, and then just quickly you're just relaxing to get the right ratio in terms of the height and the width. Snap them vertically, grab one of them, and just start stitching. So you can see once you get in that groove, it's super, super fast and easy to deal with. And it really shouldn't take you too long to UV your objects like this. The strip is complete. And now maybe I'll UV this to that nice inset detail that we have for this lip here. Make sure those horizontal edges match up nicely. And I'm always looking on my mesh if it's, it looks correct, if it's not, super squashed sometimes. If you've scaled UVs on one axis a little too much, then I'll just scale it horizontally. But it was because it was that nice ratio when we relaxed it already, and I didn't scale them horizontally or vertically. I just stitched them together and then uniformly scaled the strip down. There's no real stretching, and it's actually the perfect in terms of the ratio. Something like that. Just collapse that. There we go. For the sidewall here, I want to just give it a quick for this, I'll just add an unwrap UVW. And you can actually, inside of just the unwrap modifier, there are projections as well. So I'm just going to use a cylinder, hit fit, stretches it like crazy. Then I'm just going to scale that back down. And obviously, if you look at the polygons, they need to be a bit wider. So we're just going to scale that. And I just collapse it. So that's why I like to just basically select the polygons, only the polygons that I want to work on inside of the UVW window, because if I hit the unwrap without anything selected, it can get to start to be like really confusing. You start to see all these strips and all that kind of craziness going on. And it's not too bad, but sometimes because they're all on top of each other, it can make selecting them a bit of a pain in the ass. So that's why I usually use the method of just isolating them and then adding an unwrap modifier to just those faces. That's a nice benefit of Max. I'm sure you can do it inside of Maya as well. But if not, you can just deal with it having all these other UVs visible. But for me, it's just extra visual noise I don't want to have to deal with. So that whole method of unwrapping to a UVW map with a face, relaxing it, and then stitching the strip together is probably the go-to method that I use for 99% of any modular kit meshes that I'm doing, especially if, like I said, if it's an ornate shape around a window where it's just a flowing edge loop. As long as it's all in a perfect nice edge loop and there's no like triangles breaking that loop, that method will work perfectly. So the next method that I usually use to unwrap cylindrical loops and stuff like that, this is kind of unique to Max and I find it super, super useful. I'm just going to duplicate this over. If I add if you do this inside of the sub-object mode, so say I selected this set of faces here and then use this trick, it'll almost 100% of the time crash Max. You have to add the UVW map onto just the object. So if you want to work in that isolation method, what I would do is I would grab those faces and actually detach them into their own object. But in this case, I want to quickly strip out this entire mesh, and we're going to do it as a whole. So I'm just going to add an unwrap modifier to the mesh. You can see it already has all these UVs. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly screw up all my UVs just so it's not confusing. But what I'm going to do is in the unwrap UVW modifier here, if you scroll down, or if you have it like me where you've expanded it out to 2 panes, you're going to look for the section that says wrap. And if I'm in edge mode, you're going to see this button's available. If I'm in face mode, it's not going to be able to be used. So you go into edge mode, and then what you do is it says unfold strip from loop. And this is super, super awesome. If I click this, what you have to do is select this, select a loop that goes around your cylindrical object. So in this case, you can select this one, this one. Don't select one of the rings because you're going to get some interesting results probably. But you select one of the loops that flows around your object. Just one edge is fine, and then hit this button, bam, and you can see it's broken the entire mesh into super clean strips, all one shell. It's basically just unwrap the entire thing with completely nice straight vertical lines. But it does take it and scale it up massively. So if you look at the mesh right now, you can see that the texture is tiled about 1,000,000 times across the surface. So all I do now is just scale this down. And the nice thing about this, by doing it like this, is it keeps all of your strips in the perfect size in accordance to each other. So you don't get any weird, crazy, different textile density issues right off the bat. Like I've said in the first trim sheet video, it's okay to have slightly different textile densities if you have to squash and stretch your UVs to match the trims. But this gives you a nice starting point right off the bat. And then in this case, what I would do then to grab this is I would just grab the ring, convert it to this. So that selects me that nice like band of UVs. I just press Control B to break it. And so now I just broke it away from that UV shell. And so now you can see by doing this method, it's a lot faster. I'm pretty sure Maya or Blender have a similar tool to this. They must at this point. It's pretty standard, or there's additional UV plugins. A lot of them have something like this. And so now I can really quickly UV my mesh. So you see I scaled that up in comparison to the other one. So yeah, the textile density is changing a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. It's never going to be like super noticeable. And it's the only time it's going to be really, really noticeable is, say, I'll give you an exact example right now. So say I have that strip, and then I took all the rest of the UVs, and they were really drastically smaller. When people talk about textile density, this is what you want to avoid. Like you can even see inside of Max, if I get this out the way, nice crisp texture, horribly stretched, like blurry texture because we've scaled the UVs down so much. That's really what you want to avoid in terms of like jarring textile density differences. But if I undo that, you can see that even just by having scaled up this ring a little bit, in terms of, you can see here, so that's the original like size and width of the UV strips altogether. I've scaled it up a bit. In the viewport, you can't even be like, you can't even tell that there's that much of a difference in terms of the overall textile density between the two shells. So it's totally fine. And then I would just grab another ring, convert it to poly, Control B to break it, drag it down. And this one I'm going to be scaling up too anyways, just to match these edges. To give it this nice concrete with a little bit of a seam along the top and bottom. And yeah, you can just, even on your mesh, just select, you know, one of these top faces, and then quickly just drag select that band, break it. Scale it up. Align those grooves on the top and bottom. Boom. Now on cylindrical surfaces with like large polygons going inwards, there is going to be a bit of distortion, and I'll show you how to fix that as well. So that would be all of these faces here, mainly. And the way to fix it, usually the distortion, is to add more polygons or a couple edge loops in this piece of geometry. And that's going to help remove some of the distortion. But the reason I haven't added them yet is because I don't want to have to select, you know, 3 different sets of edge loops when I'm dealing with the UVs. I just want to select just one row of polygons. So I'll add them afterwards, because that way I'm not going in here and having to be like, okay, is it these ones? It's just, I just know it's just those faces. Boom. Not a set of 3 edge loops. And we're going to give this kind of stone block texture on the bottom. And I'm going to collapse that for now. So you can see, yeah, there's a bit of wonky stretching going on, or distortion. What I'm going to do is just select that edge ring, connect it, probably twice, maybe even 3 times. And you can see that starts to really fix some of that geometry. There is always going to be a little bit of wonkiness and distortion, but if I go back into my unwrap, I think I also need to take those faces and scale them horizontally just to stretch those bricks a little bit. And the scale tool can sometimes be a little strange. So I'm just scaling these horizontally because it looked like it was a little bit stretched. And on that, you can see I have the loop here and then the seam. On this seam, I'm just going to try and get it to maybe move the texture around until it's actually on a seam like that. And that's a little tip. If you have a seam like this with some, you know, a groove with some edge damage, that's going to help hide that texture seam too in game. You're going to have some seams here and there that are going to be unavoidable. Like if I zoom in, you can see, yeah, there's a seam here. That's just a natural part of dealing with trim sheets. There will be seams. You can learn how to hide them. You can shift the texture to try and line it up pretty perfectly. So I'm going to go through and literally use those same 2 techniques on to UV the rest of this mesh. And then we're going to catch up at the end, and I'm going to show you how to deal with your lightmap UVs in terms of having all of these strips on top of each other. When we bring it to Unreal, we're going to want to render out some light maps when we bake our lighting, and if they're all on top of each other, it's going to give us errors and problems, and I'll show you how to fix that with the second UV channel. Right now, if we look at our UVs, there's a bunch of strips on top of each other. If we were to render a normal map or a light map or something like that, it would freak out and not work, and you would have all this garbled information on top of each other. In Unreal, when you import a mesh, there is actually a tick box in the mesh import options to generate light map UVs. And what that's actually going to do for you is it's going to create a second UV channel for you automatically. So when you import a mesh into Unreal and you choose that tick box that says generate light map UVs, what it does for you is it takes all of the UVs from UV channel 1, it creates a second UV channel for you, and it does like a pack UVs on that to lay them out inside the 0 to 1 space, but not overlapping. This can be a good quick option, and most of the time you're going to get decent results with it. So I'll basically show you what it's going to do is if I select all my UV shells and just do a tools, pack UVs, and hit OK, that's pretty much what it's going to give you for your light map UVs. It might be a little bit smarter and lay them out a little bit better, but you can see there's a lot of wasted space, and that's not good because we want to use the smallest light map sizes as possible, but use as much space of those smaller light maps that we can. So what we can do is, if I undo all of this, just so my UVs don't get all messed up, we can actually create a second UV channel inside of 3ds Max or Maya or Blender, and give it a custom set of UVs that are nice and clean. that'll give us a lot better lighting results when we bake our overall lighting in the level, and allow us to use smaller light map textures, but because we're taking advantage of a nice, actually packed UV layout for our second UV channel, rather than just allowing a manual auto unwrap kind of style thing, that will give us a lot better results and be a lot more optimized. So the way you can do this is if you just select your mesh, add another unwrap UVW, and when you switch it to channel 2, if you go into the channel options, you can do this inside of Maya, Blender. Almost every 3D software allows you to have multiple UV channels. It doesn't really, it adds a little tiny bit of extra cost, but that's so far down the optimization, like in terms of priority, that I've never had someone be like, you have to remove your second UV channel, it's too expensive, or you have to optimize your vertices a little bit inside of there. It's never been a big enough of a deal, especially since probably PS2 era. So I wouldn't even worry about it. You can usually have 2, 3, sometimes even 4 UV channels on a mesh, and it's not going to be really super impactful in terms of performance. But in the case of this, Unreal uses a second UV channel by default anyways when you import your meshes, so we might as well give it a good one. To get back to this, we find the channel options, we switch it to channel 2. It's going to ask you if you want to move your existing UVs to channel 2, and that's going to basically copy the UV channel 1 to UV channel 2. I don't really care about that because I'm going to do a different clean layout, because right now everything's broken up into strips. There's a lot of seams all over this, and the more seams you have for your light map UVs, the more like black bleeding you're going to have. So we don't want our second UV channel to be the exact same as UV channel 1, because if everything's in these strips and there are these long strips, they're not going to get packed into the UV space efficiently. So I'm just going to abandon. And you can see it didn't change anything on our mesh because we're working in UV channel 2 now, and this texture is displayed on UV channel 1. So it can be a little bit confusing the first time you do this, but it's actually pretty straightforward. What a lot of people will do, and this isn't usually the best practice, is I'll just select all of their mesh, go Tools, where is it? Mapping, Flatten Mapping, bam, hit OK, and call it a day, because now it's it's uniquely laid out on top of the 0 to 1. Yeah, that might work for some meshes, but again, there's a ton of wasted UV space, and for our light maps, it's not gonna, all of this is precious space that we could use to get some really nice crisp baked lighting in our textures, and allow us to use like a 24 or 32 light map resolution instead of having to crank things up to like a 512 or a 2048, which is absolutely insane and something you should never do because your bake times are going to go through the roof. So how can we optimize this a bit? What I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly, I know for this large center circular piece, I do want it to be all one UV shell because I don't want any seams on it. It's a large flat surface, and on large flat surfaces, you want to keep the least amount of seams as possible so you don't get any light bleeding and stuff like that. So when we did the auto unwrap, it actually unwrapped it nicely on a flat, one shell for us. If it didn't, I would just select all those faces and give it a planar. Actually, that's what I'm going to do right now. Just give it a planar map, move it out the way. And then for the rest of these ring shapes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use that unfold method. Bam, that's going to do it to the whole mesh actually, so that's going to screw up our flat surface. This probably, because it's all one strip, this probably would render decently. You might have to experiment and see, like when you bake lighting, if it gives you any weird results. But what I'm going to do is, now that that's done, I'm going to just quickly select this face, grow the selection, give all these faces a planar again, because I want that to be a proper non-stretched shape. Just because when you bake your lighting, the light map UVs are basically getting a render to texture of the lighting information, so I don't want it to be rendering a round flat surface and stretching all that lighting in a weird way, if that makes sense. I just want it to be able to render to texture a nice clean version of all those faces. And then what I'm going to do for the rest of these faces, because right now if I pack my UVs again, a lot of wasted space, right? So what I'll do is I'll probably break some of these faces up. Maybe take this, select half of it, and break it. So now if I have 2 shells for the rest of that ring, if I do my pack UVs now, you can see it's a lot more efficient in terms of the usage. And basically, when you're doing lightmap UVs, it really does come down to seams versus wasted space. The more seams you have, the less wasted space you'll have, but the more noticeable you'll have light bleeding on those seams, right? So by breaking these shells in half, chances are there might be a little bit of a lightmap seam there, a little bit of a lightmap seam there, and that's something I'm willing to deal with and at least just test out. Maybe I might have to fix it later on, but I'm just going to test it out with an initial bake. So this is how you can have your trim sheets with all of those shells laid out on top of each other for UV channel 1, and then if you do a little quick custom UV channel 2, your lighting results are probably going to be a lot better inside of Unreal, and you're not going to get any weird errors saying overlapping UVs. A lot of the times you'll be able to get away fine with doing the tick box of generate UVs automatically, and I can actually show you what that looks like. Just going to quickly name this of like founded base 01A, move it to the world origin, and we're going to bring this into Unreal, and I'll show you the exact results that we get with this mesh here. So I hit import on that, and this is the window it brings up. Most of you guys are probably familiar with this if you ever used Unreal, but you can see by default it has auto generate collision ticked. That's fine. But if we expand this out, show advanced, here's where it is generate lightmap UVs. And so right now what it's going to do is it's going to use lightmap UVs, but it's going to generate them inside of Unreal, and it's going to take all of those UV channel 1 strips and pack them into a UV channel it's going to try and use for light maps. But we don't want that because we just created some nicer light map UVs that are cleaner and are going to give us better results. So I'm going to actually untick this. But it's ticked by default, so if you don't actually want to go through the process of creating clean light map UVs and just want to let it do its thing and try it out, it might save you some time. Like I said, 90% of the time it works okay, but if you want like a nice clean lighting bake, like if you're doing ArchViz stuff and you really need really clean light map UVs, probably gonna want to do your own set. And in this case, I'm unticking that generate light map UVs because I want it set up to use the light map UVs that I created myself. Import. So here's the fountain base. And right now, if I go to, there's 2 UV channels you see. So you can see here's all of our strip UVs for channel 1. And if I go to UV channel 1, because in Unreal, UV channel 1 in Max, this is where it's also confusing. Channel 1 UVs in 3D Studio Max are channel 0 UVs inside of Unreal, because Unreal is a 0-based system. So just remember, Unreal is UV channel 0 is UV channel 1 in 3ds Max. So that means channel 2 in 3ds Max is actually channel 1 inside of Unreal. A little confusing, but again, you do it a couple times to get used to it. I don't even actually look at the 0 and 1 at the end of it. I'm just like, okay, first UV channel, second UV channel. If I click that, bam, there's our light map UVs for this mesh. So you can just display those. What I'm going to do is give this that material of stone, trim 01A, bam. And so there is our mesh. And light map resolution 64 is probably fine. Might be a little bit high. If this was an actual game, you'd probably put that at like 32 or something like that. But for portfolio work, 64 is fine. You could even maybe go a little bit higher if you really wanted some super nice shadows and stuff like that. But what I'm going to do is drop this into the world. So you can see, obviously, these 2 textures look very similar because I use the exact same workflow for both and the same set of smart materials. This was more of a demonstration of showing you how I created that first texture in the first place. But you could totally make, sci-fi metal trim sheets and stuff like that. And maybe I'll do another tutorial in the future doing some more sci-fi stuff, which would be kind of cool. But you can see there's our base of our fountain. If we do a lighting bake, let's see how the results look. I'm gonna build lighting on, I'm using my the free lighting presets that I put out a while back. I already have that loaded in the scene of the basic sun, like sunny day one, and then I've just adjusted it to look like this. And I'm going to build on lighting quality medium, and I'm just going to hit build lighting, or build lighting only. So we're just going to let this bake and take a look and see if there's any crazy light map seams or light bleeding or something like that we maybe need to adjust those light map UVs. But I think it should be pretty fine. And I would actually consider this asset at an alpha level of quality probably, and totally good to hand off to the designers or other level artists so they could start world building with it. And then once maybe that overall entire level was completed, I would go back and do a polish pass on maybe the mesh or the texture if I really needed it to, maybe adding more detail or polishing the material and texture a little bit more. But I think that's totally acceptable for a very first pass on the asset, and it's good to probably, especially if you're making your own game and you have a very small team, if you can build a world that have assets of this quality, you should be in a good, a good spot if you have a decent lighting pass and some good gameplay and stuff like that. Like really noodling away in the fine details is probably going to be a waste of time for a lot of indie devs or anyone that's not really having a huge budget to invest. That's why I really like using trim textures to efficiently, quickly create a big set of art that allows me to get an entire level in place really fast. Then I can probably have a little bit of extra time to choose where I want to put my polish. So that's a really nice thing about using this method of working. Because at the end of the day, like I always say, it really is about the big picture. And if we fly around this asset with a proper lighting pass and all of the rest of the environment done up, I think this would totally be viable for most games. And like I said, if it needed a little bit of polish, do it at the end, add some decals, add some more props and set dressing, and you'd be in a really good shape. Especially if it's like if you're a solo person making a game, getting your assets to something like this, you can make some really badass looking levels. But the whole point that I would be making is don't get lost in the weeds and start polishing this one asset. Move on and do an entire level and then selectively choose where you want to put your polish. So I think that's a pretty good state to leave this in. I'm going to go through and quickly UV the rest of the fountain, just so we can get the overall asset and see how it looks as a whole with using that same trim sheet to give a nice big stone fountain centerpiece. So yeah, I just UV'd this center fountain piece, literally using the exact same techniques, and it probably took me about 10 minutes, including doing a quick light map UVs on channel 2. So if I add an unwrap, here you can see channel 1, everything's all stripped out. Switch to channel 2, hit abandon because I don't want to copy the UV channel 1 to UV channel 2. And you can see I've just used the exact same technique to give these light map UVs. It's pretty simple. You can see where the seams are. So I'm going to quickly bring this into Unreal and wrap this whole thing up. So the mesh is now inside of Unreal. I remembered to untick that generate light map UVs just because I did create that second UV channel inside of Max. If you want to roll the dice and test how it works with your UV channel ones laid out cleanly in the auto-generated ones, feel free to go ahead. So there we go, we've built lighting, and you can see the final result. And as you can see, it matches pretty well with the original trim texture example that I made, because I was using the similar set of smart materials and the exact same workflow. So you can see now that I have these two materials created, I could probably actually go ahead and get a pretty decent modular kit going using the two different types of materials. And with maybe one or two different textures added to the mix, I could probably even build out an entire old ancient city full of like modular pieces and buildings and stuff like that. So you hopefully can see just how powerful this method is. And now you should have a really good grasp on quickly UVing your meshes and making your own assets with a limited set of textures and getting really creative and seeing where you can reuse and hopefully save a lot of time during your block out phase or your asset creation phase for your game. I will also be adding all of this new content into the existing Gumroad example files pack that I put out for the first tutorial. I know a lot of people picked that up and sent me messages saying that playing around with all those example files, like opening the meshes in Maya or Blender or whatever software they were using, and actually playing around with the UV layouts for themselves really helped the concepts of trim sheets click in their mind, and they went on to create their own environments and their own trim sheets now that they really got a full grasp on the concept. So a huge thanks to anyone who's already picked those up. And if you haven't grabbed them and you're interested in playing around with these trim sheets and the meshes and stuff, all that content will be in those files. I'll leave a link in the description. And a huge thanks to anyone who picks that up. It's a great way to support the channel as well as get some content to play around with for yourself. But I do have one final tip for you guys here, and it's going to be how to actually preview your trim sheets on your meshes in Substance Painter. And it's super, super quick and easy. I'm just going to hop back into Max here. I've duplicated my fountain, the two pieces, and attached them all together because we need it to be one mesh. And basically what I'm going to do is, the name in Max doesn't matter. I put it at the world origin, and we're going to use the same method that we used to test the tiling. So what I'm going to do is actually export this. Oh, before we export it, the one important thing you need to do is the name of your, so here's our Substance Painter file that you saw from the last video. The name of your material in Max has to be the name of your material in Substance Painter because we're going to be overwriting this mesh. And as long as the two material names match up, it's going to work out perfectly. So in Max, I've named my actual material Stone Trim 01A. It's applied to this mesh. I'm just going to quickly export this. And I'm just going to export this as the trim sheet low FBX. That FBX originally was just containing this plane. But because Substance Painter has already had that full texture built inside of it, what we can do now is go to Edit, Project Configuration, and for the file, we're going to select that trim sheet low, hit OK, and it's just going to rebuild the material inside of Painter real quick. And you can see now we have actually our completely different geometry, but it's using that 2D image, and it's just using all the UVs that we set up to project it onto this 3D geometry. And now we could even go into something like iRay inside of here and get like a nice render of our object. If you want, you can also, if you don't want this background, you can go to clear color, tick that, maybe drop the value down, something like that. And now we can actually see how in Substance Painter we can get a nice render of our mesh and our assets, or just see how the material would look like in like an offline renderer like Octane or something like that. All right, guys, there you go. So that's pretty much the A to Z's of creating trim sheets. This is a fairly simple example, but if you look on ArtStation, there are some crazily complex trim sheets out there. If you enjoyed this 4-part tutorial, let me know down in the comments below. Did I miss something? Was it concise enough? I really like your guys' feedback. Don't forget to smash the thumbs up button, subscribe if you're not already. So go forth and make some badass trim sheets. I know ever since I put out the first tutorial on this subject a while back, all over ArtStation, Instagram, Twitter, I've seen people taking that tutorial and applying it to their own work, and that really makes me smile because it means people are able to understand the content and put in the hard work to really get some nice results. And I'm always happy to see people actually executing on the information that I put out because I can put out tutorials till the end of time, but it's totally on you guys to actually take that information, apply it to your work, and grow as an artist. And that always makes me really, really happy when I see that. As always, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.